Imagine a woman's heart racing as she sees her ex-boyfriend holding a small child in his arms, begging for change at the airport. Their eyes meet for a brief moment, and she feels a mix of shock, compassion, and a familiar ache stirring within her. The scene stirs up memories of a shared past, broken dreams, and a sense of helplessness in the face of life's twists and turns. Have you ever found yourself at such a deep emotional crossroads? That overwhelming feeling of wanting to help, of wanting to fix the problem of someone who was once part of your story. How do you cope with this whirlwind of emotions and find a way to move forward while keeping your emotional integrity intact? Let's explore together how to turn moments of discomfort into opportunities for personal growth and overcoming challenges. Lorena was finally coming home after spending the last few years in Japan on an exchange program. This trip was one of the biggest dreams of her life, but to make it happen, she had to give up her great love, Daniel. He promised he would wait for her until she returned, but Lorena's mother, Mrs. Esther, convinced her to end the relationship, saying it was interfering with her future. 2 years later, as she landed at the airport, Lorena didn't expect to find Daniel begging for change. Lorena's heart raced as the plane landed at Curitiba Airport. She had been looking forward to this moment for months, eager to return to the comforting embrace of her mother and relive the memories of a life that seemed to be left behind. However, as she stepped off the plane and looked around, a wave of nostalgia and uncertainty enveloped her. The familiar air of the city brought to mind memories of a past she had left behind, with smiles and tears, promises and farewells, all mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions she hadn't yet fully grasped. As she blended into the crowd at the airport exit, Lorena's eyes wandered over the surroundings, catching every face and movement of the passing people. She was standing on the sidewalk, unsuccessfully trying to hail a taxi, when she heard in the distance, amid the crowd, a young man begging with a child in his arms. Both seemed out of place and vulnerable. A shiver ran down Lorena's spine as she recognized something familiar in the young man's posture. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached with hesitant steps and confused thoughts. As she got closer, her eyes met those of the young man, and she saw the confirmation of her suspicions reflected in his gaze. It was Daniel, the great love of her life, right in front of her. Time seemed to freeze as Lorena watched him, absorbing every detail of his face. He looked older now, more tired, but there was still a spark of familiarity in his eyes that made Lorena's heart ache. Daniel was there, before her, yet at the same time, so distant. The reality of the situation hit Lorena like a punch in the gut. She had made a difficult decision leaving Daniel behind. When Lorena decided to travel to Japan, she followed her mother's advice, seeking new opportunities beyond the borders of her hometown. But now, all the memories of the happy days they spent together invaded her mind, bringing with them a deep and crushing pain. The silence between them was deafening, filled with the weight of all the unspoken words and unanswered questions. Lorena wanted to run into Daniel's arms, to shout his name and release all the anguish she had carried since she left. But something held her back, keeping her still and silent, trapped in a limbo between the past and the present. As Lorena struggled to find the right words, Daniel looked at her with a mix of sadness and resignation in his eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask, but the words seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. Lorena felt her heart race as Daniel, overcome with panic, held the child tightly and began to run. A whirlwind of emotions surrounded her as she instinctively followed Daniel, her legs moving almost on their own in a desperate attempt to reach him. The city streets slid past her eyes, and the faces of the pedestrians became indistinct blurs as Lorena chased after Daniel and the child. Her thoughts were a mess, a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and worry, all swirling in her mind like a furious storm. As she ran, Lorena desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was Daniel out there, begging for change on the street, while she was thousands of miles away? Where were the dreams they had shared and the promises they made to each other when they were young and full of hope? Lorena's breath was coming in ragged gasps as she continued to chase Daniel, her footsteps echoing through the now empty city streets. As they got closer to the end of that desperate chase, Lorena knew she couldn't let him escape without getting answers and understanding what had happened to the man she once loved more than anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of pursuit, Daniel stopped abruptly in front of a square, breathing unevenly. He looked back, his eyes filled with fear and anguish. Lorena approached slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest, and stopped in front of him, unable to speak. She then grabbed Daniel by the shoulders, preventing him from running away again. As time seemed to freeze around them, the air was thick with an almost palpable tension, and Lorena felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Daniel," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "What happened? Why are you here? Where are our dreams?" Daniel lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. "I tried, Lorena. I really tried. But things got tough, and I didn't know what to do anymore." Lorena felt a wave of compassion and sadness wash over her. She remembered the happy moments they had shared, the plans they made for the future. Now, everything seemed so distant and unreal. "We're here now, Daniel," she said softly. "We can work through this together. No matter what happened, there's still hope." Daniel looked up at her, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry, Lorena. I'm sorry for everything." Lorena pulled Daniel into a tight embrace, feeling the child between them. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to face any obstacle alongside Daniel. Together, they could find a way to rebuild the dreams they once shared and create a better future for the child they now held in their arms. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the square, Lorena felt a new determination growing inside her. She looked at Daniel and the child, their hearts beating in unison, and knew that despite all the difficulties, they still had a chance to find the happiness they so desired. Part 1. The Reunion. Lorena felt the tension in the air like a tightrope around her. It was as if all the years of separation were weighing on her shoulders, making even breathing difficult. She looked into Daniel's eyes and saw the pain and desperation reflected there. Tears ran down his face like an endless river. The child in Daniel's arms began to cry, sensing the tension in the air, and Lorena felt a lump forming in her throat. She knew this was the moment to resolve all the past issues. It was time to confront everything and find a way to move forward. Part 2. The Courage to Speak. Gasping and still trying to catch her breath after the frantic chase through the city streets, Lorena didn't know where to start. Words seemed to elude her, slipping from her mind as she struggled to express all the emotions consuming her at that moment. Finally, after a long moment of tense silence, Lorena found the courage to speak, her voice coming out weak and trembling. "Daniel, it's been so long. Why did you run? Who is this child? What's going on?" Lorena looked at Daniel, desperately waiting for an answer that didn't come. He remained silent, and tears continued to stream down his face like a river of repressed emotions. She could feel the pain he carried, but she needed to understand what had brought him to this state. Part 3. The Truth is Essential. "Daniel, please," she begged, her voice trembling with the intensity of her emotions. "You need to tell me what happened. I can't leave here until you tell me the truth." At that moment, a police car pulled up beside them. The officer looked suspiciously at the situation and asked Lorena, "Ma'am, is this young man bothering you? Crime has been on the rise. If you need help, let us know now. It's time for this vagrant to be taken to a shelter," and this child referred to Child Protective Services. Hearing this, Lorena was startled. She knew she couldn't say goodbye to Daniel without resolving things. She looked at the man before her, the man who had once been the love of her life, and knew she couldn't abandon him now, not when he needed her most. Outraged by the police's attitude and determined to understand the whole situation, Lorena finally replied, "It's fine. This is an old acquaintance of mine, and we're just talking. Please, don't worry about us." Part 4. Relief and Determination. The officer continued to look at the situation with suspicion, but after Lorena's response, the police car finally left. At that moment, relief washed over Lorena for a few seconds. The fear of Daniel being taken away and losing the chance to clarify what was happening overwhelmed her. She knew this conversation was essential and that she needed to understand everything. Lorena felt a surge of determination. She looked into Daniel's eyes and promised herself she would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Lorena and Danny were standing in the square, the child in her arms. The silence between them was as thick as fog. It felt like the air was charged with tension, as if something very important was about to be said, something painful just to think about. Even the presence of the police nearby made everything more tense. "Daniel, please, tell me what happened," Lorena asked again, her voice both gentle and firm. "I need to understand. I need to know." Daniel sighed, running his hand through his disheveled hair. Finally, he found the courage to speak. He asked Lorena to sit on a nearby bench. "I need to calm down a bit before I tell you everything," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, filled with the pain of the years he had endured. As they sat down, Lorena felt an urgency to address what had been troubling her. "My mother told me about your ex-wife's pregnancy," she began, hoping for some reaction from Daniel. She wanted an explanation that would make sense of everything that had happened during their time apart. Each word seemed heavy, filled with accumulated doubts and hurt. Daniel sighed bitterly before responding. "Your mother told you everything, didn't she? You stopped communicating with me, Lorena. You didn't even bother to call and ask what was going on. You just believed everything your mother said, didn't you?" His words were filled with pain and accusation, something Lorena couldn't ignore. She found herself confronted with the possibility that she had misjudged the whole situation, influenced by her mother's incomplete and biased information, who had always been against their relationship. Each word from Daniel seemed to cut at her heart, making her question all the choices she had made since moving to Japan. Daniel continued to speak. "If you only knew what happened. I don't know if I have the strength to continue. It's hard to see you doing well while my life has crumbled. I asked your mother to give me your new contact in Japan, but she said you didn't want to talk to me." A wave of regret and a sense of injustice flooded Lorena. She realized she had allowed her mother's negative influence to affect her perspective and actions. Lorena was sitting in the square with Daniel. Her eyes were filled with tears, on the verge of falling. I'm so sorry, Daniel," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have believed everything my mother said. I should have given you a chance to tell your side of the story." Daniel looked at her, sad. "I understand, Lorena," he said softly, "but we can't change the past. We can only try to understand and move forward." Lorena nodded, shaking her head. She knew Daniel was right. She couldn't go back in time and change her choices, but she could learn from her mistakes and try to fix what she still could. As they were standing there, the sun began to set on the horizon, and Lorena felt a glimmer of hope. She knew this conversation would be difficult, but she was relieved to finally learn what had happened during the years she was away. Suddenly, Lorena felt furious at the thought that Daniel had been involved with another woman. Despite her mother's advice to forget the relationship and focus on the exchange program to improve her future, she had never stopped loving Daniel. "Did you get another woman pregnant, Daniel?" she asked, her voice full of pain. "I was on the other side of the world thinking about you, and you replaced me?" Daniel saw the sincerity in Lorena's eyes and felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He knew he needed to tell the whole truth, even if it meant reliving painful moments. He took a deep breath, trying to find the courage. "Lorena, I never wanted to hurt you," he began, his voice trembling. "When you went to Japan, I was lost. I missed you every day, and the loneliness was overwhelming. I never replaced you." Lorena listened attentively, her hands shaking, trying to hold back tears. She wanted to believe Daniel and find a way to forgive him, but the pain was still fresh, like a knife cutting deep. Daniel's heart was broken. He was still recovering from the end of his relationship with Lorena and his trip to Japan. But then, someone else entered his life. Daniel began to speak, his voice trembling. "Lorena, I was very sad and weak. I made a terrible mistake and have regretted it every day since." Lorena felt a tightness in her chest. The thought of Daniel with another woman was like a heavy weight on her heart. She wanted to scream, cry, and run away, but she knew she needed to face the truth. She needed to find a way to forgive Daniel and move on with her life. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice choked with tears, "I know I need to forgive you, but it's very difficult for me. I need time to process all this. I just hope that one day we can get through this together." Daniel felt wronged by everything that had happened in the past few years, and decided to clarify the facts. He began to tell his version of the story. When Lorena went to Japan, Daniel focused on his final exams in medical school. He studied all the time. One day, after leaving the university tired, he ran into Estella, a childhood friend and also a classmate. It had been only a few weeks since Lorena went to Japan. Estella was one of the most popular girls on campus, heir to a very wealthy family. When she saw Daniel, she offered him a ride home. He accepted, trusting her. After all, Estella had always been a friend. On the way, Estella stopped at a gas station and went into the convenience store. She came back with a bottle of beer and offered it to Daniel, who, exhausted from studying, accepted without thinking of the consequences. What happened next changed Daniel's life. He paused, tears in his eyes, and recounted that, after a few sips of the beer, he started feeling strange. His legs felt heavy, and his vision began to blur. Daniel suspected he had been drugged, but it was too late. Estella took him to a motel, where things only got worse. As Daniel told his story, Lorena felt a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted to understand, but it was hard. Daniel, for his part, was filled with regret and pain. He knew he had made a mistake, but didn't know how to fix it. Lorena needed time to process everything. She needed to find a way to forgive Daniel and move on. Daniel's story was hard to hear, but it was the truth. He never wanted to hurt Lorena, but he ended up making a terrible mistake. Now, he could only hope that one day they could find a way to overcome all this together. Lorena, on the other hand, knew that forgiveness was hard but necessary to move on with her life. Daniel began recounting his story, his voice trembling as he recalled the events that had changed his life forever. "If I could go back in time, I would have done everything differently, Lorena. I would have gone after you in Japan. I accepted that beer without imagining the consequences. After that, everything turned into a blur in my mind. Just confusing and fragmented flashes passed through my head, making no sense at all," he said. Then, Daniel described how he woke up the next morning in a strange room, with intense pain and an overwhelming sense of shame. Next to him, Estella was lying in bed, a satisfied smile on her lips. Daniel's stomach churned as she began to speak. Estella's words were laden with malice and cruelty. "I really enjoyed the night we had, Daniel," she said in a casual tone that made the words even more disturbing. "I think Lorena will enjoy seeing our video too." Daniel felt the ground vanish beneath his feet when Estella mentioned the video. Horrified, he saw the footage she had recorded, showing him altered and vulnerable, unable to defend himself from that woman's cruel manipulations. Daniel finally understood what had been happening and that he had been used by Estella. Lorena listened in silence, horror spreading across her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what Daniel was sharing. She had never imagined that something so terrible could happen, or that someone could be so cruel and inhumane to him. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she murmured, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him with compassion. Daniel went on to say that he was terrified and tried to understand the motive behind such monstrosity. Estella revealed that she had put something in his beer and filmed the night they had, ensuring that no one would believe him if he tried to report her. She said the video would be proof that he had enjoyed himself in a cruel manipulation that left him with no escape. Desperate, Daniel fled from the motel where Estella had taken him. He cried all night, not knowing how to deal with the situation. The cruelty of the betrayal by someone he trusted left him deeply scarred. Revisiting the story to clarify the past with Lorena was painful. Daniel struggled against tears as he recalled the terrible night caused by Estella's trap. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up, and his mind spun as he returned to the horror of that experience. Every word Daniel shared seemed to intensify Lorena's anguish. She was by his side, trying to find a way to comfort him, but felt powerless in the face of the cruelty he had endured. "I never thought something like this could happen," Lorena said, her voice choked with emotion. "You didn't deserve to go through this." Daniel looked at her, pain and despair reflected in his eyes. "I just wanted all of this to end," he said, his voice breaking. "I wish I could forget, but it's as if those memories are etched in my mind, haunting me every moment." Lorena held his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not alone, Daniel. We'll find a way to get through this together," she promised, determined to help her friend find peace and justice. As Daniel finished his narrative, a heavy silence hung in the air. They both knew that the journey to healing would be long and difficult, but with each other's support, they were ready to face the challenges ahead. Daniel knew he had a long road ahead, but Lorena's presence by his side gave him new hope. They were ready to rebuild their lives and leave the shadows of the past behind. It was a difficult day for Daniel. When he remembered everything that had happened, it felt like he was reliving every moment of humiliation and despair. He felt so small and powerless against Estella's cruelty. She had manipulated Daniel and destroyed everything he loved and believed in. In a matter of minutes, Lorena listened in silence. Inside her, a mix of anger and compassion burned like fire. She thought about what Daniel had been through and had never felt such hatred for someone as she felt for Estella at that moment. The idea that someone could cause so much suffering to another person made her sick to her core. Daniel told Lorena that he decided not to go to the police because he was afraid of the power and influence of Estella's family in the city. He wanted to forget the incident and focus on his studies. But shortly afterward, he received a call from Estella saying she was pregnant. The news was devastating. And as if that wasn't enough, the same week, Daniel learned that his father's health, the only member of his family, was deteriorating rapidly. Because of this, Daniel was forced to give up on graduating from medical school, even though he was so close to graduation. His father's illness was a cruel battle against an unforgiving disease and became a shadow hanging over Daniel, obscuring any hope of light. He found himself plunged into a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, struggling to cope with the pain of the past while facing the inevitable fate of his father. In the following months, his father's health worsened increasingly quickly. Every day was a fight against the inevitability of the approaching death. Daniel rushed between the hospital and his home, desperate to spend every precious moment by his father's side before it was too late. And then, one day, his father was gone, leaving Daniel completely devastated and alone to face his new reality. The loss of his father was a profound blow, leaving him adrift in a sea of sadness and despair, like a wound that seemed never to heal. Lorena listened in silence as Daniel's pain echoed in her own soul. She tried to imagine the agony he had faced in recent years. She wanted to comfort him and ease his pain, but knew that no words could console a broken heart. During the funeral, Daniel suffered another harsh blow. Estella appeared unexpectedly, casting an even darker shadow over a moment already marked by sorrow. She called him aside to talk, and her presence felt like a dagger to Daniel's still aching heart. Estella wasted no time and began threatening him, her voice whispering poison as she spoke. And so, Daniel continued to live with the weight of all these memories and emotions. But with Lorena's support, he began to find small sparks of hope and strength to move forward, even though the path still seemed long and difficult. Daniel was in trouble. Estella, with a serious and firm look, told him that if he didn't take responsibility for the baby, everyone in town would know soon. She wasn't joking. "You have two simple options, Daniel," she said, with a tone that made it clear there was no middle ground. "Either you stay with me and our child, living happily together, or you'll have to face the consequences of not fulfilling your responsibilities." Daniel felt pressured. He knew that Estella came from a wealthy and powerful family and would not hesitate to use that against him. So, with little choice, he agreed to live a life of lies, just to protect his future. Months passed, and Estella gave birth to a beautiful baby named Kaio. They lived together in a luxurious apartment in the city center, which belonged to her family. But behind the facade of happiness, there was a dark shadow growing, threatening to engulf them. A year after Kaio's birth, Estella fled, leaving behind only a note. She said she could no longer live with Daniel and deserved to be happy. Daniel was devastated to see his life crumble around him. When he sought support from Estella's family, he was met with coldness and indifference. They said that Kaio was an illegitimate child and that their relationship was a disgrace to the family. Daniel felt completely alone and lost. His life became a heap of broken promises and shattered dreams. Even so, he knew he needed to move forward, facing the darkness alone. After his father's death and being kicked out of the luxurious apartment, Daniel found himself with nowhere to go except the streets and shelters of the city. He struggled to take care of Kaio, while the story of his difficult life left Lorena deeply shaken. She then realized how much she had been influenced by her mother's cruel opinions, who had never supported her relationship with Daniel. Her mother's words echoed in Lorena's mind, revealing the sad consequences of judging without understanding. Lorena wrapped Daniel in a warm hug, feeling the weight of regret in every word. "I wish I had been by your side from the beginning, Daniel, to support you," she murmured with a trembling voice. The sparkle in her eyes revealed a mix of determination and remorse. She had finally realized how much her mother had influenced her decisions in the past, sometimes against her own feelings. It was time to make things right. Daniel held Lorena's hands with gratitude and love. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but the uncertain future seemed more promising with her by his side. "Thank you, Lorena. You mean a lot to me," he said sincerely, making it clear how important she was to him. Sitting on the park bench, Lorena and Daniel looked out at the horizon, planning a new beginning together. They decided to spend the holidays in Brazil, choosing a cozy house in the countryside to reconnect away from the distractions of daily life. Lorena wanted more than just a vacation. She wanted to rebuild Daniel's trust and provide a safe environment for him and his son, Kaio. Every shared moment was an opportunity to heal the wounds of the past and strengthen the bonds that united them. Determined to prove that they deserved a second chance, Lorena decided to formalize their relationship a week before they went back home. Despite the short time since they had reunited, the depth of their feelings was undeniable. They promised a simple yet meaningful celebration to mark the beginning of their new journey together. Moreover, Lorena felt it was the right time to formalize her relationship with Kaio through adoption, further solidifying their new family. When they returned, they found a small house in the city that seemed like the perfect place to start anew together. But before settling in, Lorena decided to face one last emotional challenge: visiting her mother, Mrs. Esther, who had been distant in recent weeks. Lorena had been calling her mother nonstop since returning from Japan. She was worried because Lorena hadn't given any news. Lorena knew she needed to talk to her about something very important: her decision to marry Daniel. But she knew that this conversation would be difficult. Determined to face the truth, Lorena went to her mother's house. When she arrived, she found Mrs. Esther very shaken, crying and trying to explain her actions with words that were unconvincing. "Everything I did was out of love for you, Lorena. How could you come back from Japan and not come home?" Mrs. Esther said desperately. Lorena looked firmly at her mother. With courage, she said, "Mom, you had no right to influence my life this way. You made me give up Daniel for the exchange program, almost ruining his life. He and I are a family now, forever. I can't let your manipulations and lies control my future any longer." It was a difficult moment, filled with strong emotions and painful truths. Lorena knew it was time to cut ties with her mother's toxic past and move forward, building a life based on love and honesty. The visit to Mrs. Esther's house was tense, but Lorena remained resolute. Her mother did not accept her decision and insisted that she was making a mistake by taking responsibility for another person's child. "You're going to regret it, girl. Save your life before it's too late," Mrs. Esther insisted, disapproving and worried. But Lorena was determined to move forward with her new family. Looking into her mother's eyes, she affirmed with determination, "I'm not going to abandon Daniel and my son. They are not to blame for the circumstances and deserve a chance to be happy." As the discussion continued in the living room, Lorena did not let herself be intimidated. She knew she would face criticism and judgment, but she was willing to endure it all for the sake of her new family. As she said goodbye to Mrs. Esther, Lorena felt a mix of sadness and relief. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was sure she was doing the right thing by protecting Daniel and Kaio. With her heart warmed by the certainty of her choices, she returned to her rented home with Daniel, ready to face the future with courage. One day, Lorena was shopping in the city to set up her new house. Suddenly, she saw Estella in a store. Estella immediately spoke in a provocative tone. "You're back in town, even after losing your boyfriend? I bet he's a mess." Despite being furious, Lorena kept her composure. She looked Estella in the eyes and said firmly, "I could take you down now, but I won't dirty my hands. One day, you will pay for everything you've done. Daniel and our son are my family now," she continued. Estella tried to laugh off the threat, but Lorena's serious look made it clear she meant what she said. Estella was frightened by Lorena's determination. She thought the past would never haunt her again. Lorena turned her back and walked away, leaving Estella stunned. For a moment, Estella felt the weight of her past actions like a dark shadow of guilt and fear. Meanwhile, Lorena moved forward with her head held high. She knew she had done the right thing by not stooping to Estella's level. She promised herself that justice would be served, even if it took time. A month later, Lorena and Daniel were settling into their new home when they received significant news. Estella had been arrested. She was accused of serious crimes like drug trafficking and harming others. The news brought a mix of relief and happiness to the couple. They finally felt that justice was being served. They decided to start their lives anew, once and for all. They decided to move to another country with their son. They chose Japan, where Lorena had lived for a few years. It was a chance to start over, away from the painful memories of the past. In the first months in their new country, they faced many challenges. But with great courage and determination, Lorena and Daniel managed to overcome them. They knew that better days were ahead. Away from the people who had tried to hurt them, they found a safe place to raise their child and build a new story together. Lorena and Daniel discovered that each new day in Japan was like a bright opportunity for growth and renewal. Since moving there, they felt immense peace and hope in their hearts. They looked forward with optimism, ready to face any challenge life might bring. Together, they were determined to write a new chapter full of love, courage, and unwavering determination in search of their well-deserved happiness. A year after moving to Oka, they decided to celebrate their union in a small chapel in the city. The ceremony was simple but full of meaning, with their new friends and old exchange colleagues of Lorena in attendance. The modest decorations reflected the true love they shared. The most emotional moment was when Kaio brought the rings, with a shy and proud smile. It seemed that this simple gesture not only united Lorena and Daniel, but also formed a new family based on love, trust, and mutual commitment. Lorena radiated happiness in her wedding dress, looking at Daniel with tenderness, ready to embark on an exciting journey by his side. Daniel felt deep gratitude and love as he looked at Lorena. He knew he had found his soulmate, someone willing to share all the joys and sorrows of life. As they exchanged vows of eternal love, the small chapel overflowed with joy and hope, marking the beginning of a new phase for the family. As they left the chapel as husband and wife, Lorena and Daniel felt as if they had won the lottery by finding each other. After the wedding party, they moved to Japan, away from the people who had caused them trouble. There, they dedicated themselves to creating a safe and loving home for their child. Distance and time protected them from the shadows of the past, and they finally found the peace they had been seeking. Lorena often reflected on everything they had been through to get there. In one of these reflections, she asked Daniel, "Do you believe that when we're meant to be with someone, nothing can separate us?" This question echoed throughout their journey, reinforcing the idea that true love can overcome any challenge. Together, Lorena and Daniel discovered that happiness lies in the simple moments they share and in the strength of the love that binds them. They walked hand in hand toward the future, grateful for the profound meaning of love, which strengthened and inspired them to live each day with passion and purpose. With this love as their guide, they were ready to face any challenge the future might bring. They knew that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. So, did you like the story? The channel, Universo Ian Palabras, thanks you for your company. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you thought of the story. See you next time.